You want $5,000 to save that garbage dump full of your broken veterans? Daniel, my brother sneered, throwing the check directly onto the grass. Step in here and last 3 minutes in the ring with me. If you drop tomorrow morning, I'll drive the bulldozer myself and flatten that camp. That was the gift my family gave me right in the middle of a lavish party. Around us, the elite guests and even my own parents clapped and cheered. They were eager to watch my 6'3" MMA black belt brother humiliate his mud-covered younger sister. They ruthlessly ignored the fact that back home my wounded brother in arms was crying in despair because he was about to lose his only shelter. My brother cracked his knuckles looking smugly at my hunched, bowed figure. He thought he was about to get 180 seconds to break a pathetic lamb, but he forgot one brutal truth. I quietly unlaced my combat boots, looked up straight into his eyes, and my lips curled slightly. Are you sure? You can last 3 minutes. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Staring into his cold, arrogant eyes on that pristine manicured lawn, the sharp, overwhelming scent of his expensive designer cologne violently dragged me backward. It hit my senses like a physical blow, instantly transporting me 20 years into the past. Snorts, that exact same twisted, condescending sneer had haunted my nightmares for 2 decades. It was the sneer of a boy who was taught from birth that he owned the world, and that I was merely the dirt beneath his expensive shoes, standing there with my bare, scarred feet sinking into the imported grass. I could feel the oppressive weight of the Reed family estate crashing down on my shoulders all over again. The heavy oak doors, the suffocating silence of the mansion hallways, the constant feeling of being a trespasser in my own home. It all came rushing back. He looked at me now, exactly the way he looked at me. Then, like a defective toy he could not wait to break. The terrified little girl he used to torment died a long time ago, buried under years of military discipline and survival instincts. Yet, for a split second, the sheer cruelty of his gaze threatened to paralyze my inner child, demanding that I submit to his unearned authority, just like I always did. When I was 15 years old, the brutal hierarchy of the Reed estate was already carved in stone and enforced daily by my parents. My brother Daniel was the untouchable, infallible golden child. Every minor sports trophy he won, every aggressive tackle on the football field was celebrated with massive, lavish banquets that filled the house with cheering guests. Meanwhile, my perfect academic records and quiet achievements were shoved into dusty drawers completely unread and unacknowledged. I learned very early on to walk the grand hallways of the mansion without making a single sound, existing as an invisible ghost in my own home. If I spoke up, I was scolded for being too loud. If I stayed quiet, I was ignored entirely. I spent my teenage years hiding in the sprawling library, reading military history books to escape the reality that I was entirely unwanted. I watched from the shadows as my parents actively groomed my brother, praising his bullying behavior at school as natural leadership. They were building a ruthless capitalist, and I was just a byproduct of their marriage. They never missed an opportunity to remind me that I lacked the killer instinct necessary to carry the family name, constantly comparing my quiet empathy to his loud, destructive dominance. 2 years later, when I was 17, the final illusion of family safety was shattered. I had spent 3 grueling months building a complex mechanical engineering project for a state competition, pouring all my desperate need for validation into the work. One afternoon, my brother walked into the dining room, saw the project taking up space on the table, and casually smashed it to pieces with a golf club. He did not do it out of anger. He did it simply because he could. When I cried, devastated by the ruins of my hard work, my parents did not reprimand him. Instead, my father sighed in annoyance, sipping his scotch. "Don't be so incredibly sensitive, Sarah," he muttered. "He's just expressing himself. Clean up this mess." It was in that exact crushing moment I realized that empathy and vulnerability were considered fatal diseases in this house. They viewed his malice as strength and my tears as a pathetic weakness. I stopped crying that day. I swept up the broken pieces of my project, and with it, I swept up the last remaining shreds of hope that I would ever be loved. I locked my bedroom door that night and made a silent, ironclad promise to myself that I would never shed another tear for the Reed family. Exactly 3 days after my 18th birthday, I executed the decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. I realized with absolute clarity that I would never earn a single drop of their affection, no matter how hard I tried to fit into their twisted mold. I stopped trying entirely. In the dead of night, while the massive estate was dead silent, I packed a single olive drab canvas duffel bag. I did not take any of the expensive dresses or jewelry my mother had forced upon me for social events. I only packed the bare essentials, stripping away every physical tie to the Reed fortune. I walked down the long winding driveway, the cold biting at my cheeks without ever looking back at the towering mansion. I did not leave a note. No one woke up to stop me. No one even noticed I was gone until the maid checked my room the next afternoon. I was determined to find a place where my deep simmering pain actually had a purpose. As I walked miles in the dark toward the highway, the crushing weight of their expectations finally lifted off my chest, replaced by a terrifying but exhilarating sense of absolute freedom. A week after walking away from the suffocating walls of the mansion, I marched straight into a Marine Corps recruiting station. The stark contrast was incredibly jarring. The office smelled of stale coffee floor, wax and sweat, a massive departure from the crystal chandeliers and imported perfumes of my past. I sat across from a grizzled recruiter who looked at my soft manicured hands and raised an eyebrow, clearly doubting that a wealthy runaway could survive the military machine. But when I spoke, my voice was dead calm and devoid of any hesitation. I eagerly signed away my civilian freedom, permanently trading my silk bed sheets for an olive drab cot and a pair of heavy blister-inducing combat boots. As my pen scratched across the enlistment contract sealing my fate, I felt a profound sense of ownership over my own life for the very first time. I was not just running away from my brother's shadow or my parents' emotional neglect. I was running toward a crucible that would either destroy me completely or forge me into something unbreakable. The recruiter stamped my paperwork unknowingly, handing me the only escape route I had left. I walked out of that strip mall office with a shipping date in hand, ready to bleed sweat and suffer, knowing that whatever pain the Marines inflicted on me would never compare to the psychological torture of living as a Reed. 6 months later, the brutal reality of the Paris Island crucible pushed me to the absolute limits of human endurance. Boot camp broke me down, physically, tearing my muscles and leaving my feet covered in bleeding, agonizing blisters. But it systematically rebuilt my shattered self-esteem from the ground up. The screaming drill instructors getting inches from my face did not care about my last name, my family's massive wealth, or the zip code I came from. For the first time in my entire existence, I was judged strictly by my grit, my refusal to quit, and my fierce loyalty to the recruits suffering right beside me. When I dragged a heavier recruit through the mud under barbed wire while live rounds echoed above, I realized my inherent empathy was not a disease, it was a tactical asset. I learned to channel my years of suppressed anger into physical stamina. With every agonizing mile run in the pouring rain, I shed another layer of the worthless, invisible girl my parents had created. The military stripped away the victimhood my brother had forced upon me, replacing it with the hardened, calloused pride of a warrior who earned every single breath. When they finally handed me the Eagle Globe and Anchor emblem, pinning it to my uniform, I knew I had successfully rewritten my DNA. I was no longer a Reed, I was a United States Marine. During my first combat deployment overseas, the isolating reality of war momentarily cracked my armored shell. Sitting in a dusty, sweltering tent in Afghanistan, listening to the distant, terrifying thud of artillery fire, a moment of profound weakness overtook me. Surrounded by Marines who were excitedly reading letters from home, I craved just one single word of validation from the family I had left behind. I wrote a letter to my parents, keeping it brief and devoid of emotion, simply stating I was alive and fighting on the front lines. I mailed it off and waited. I checked the mail call every single week for months. Every single week, I walked up to the distribution table, scanning the pile for a return address from the estate. Every single week, nothing. The agonizing silence that followed was a physical blow to my chest. Other Marines received care packages stuffed with cookies and photographs. I received the deafening sound of deliberate abandonment. The letters were never answered. Not a single line, not even a cold, dismissive postcard acknowledging that their daughter was alive in a war zone. That deafening, continuous silence confirmed what I had always feared. My bloodline had officially and permanently erased me. I imagined my brother turning my empty bedroom into another one of his private gyms, laughing at my pathetic attempt to reach out. That unanswered letter was the final nail in the coffin of my childhood. I burned my parents' address mentally, severing the last fragile thread, tethering me to my toxic past. From that day forward, I stopped looking backward. The military became my only family, and I swore I would never again beg for love from people who were entirely incapable of giving it. Over the next decade, I earned my officer rank through sheer blood tactical brilliance and an uncompromising refusal to fail. Pinning the captain's bars to my collar was not just a career milestone. It was the ultimate proof of my self-worth. I learned to completely compartmentalize my trauma, turning my deep-seated pain into cold, calculating leadership that kept my Marines alive in the deadliest combat zones. I led troops into blistering firefights, making split-second life or death decisions with a steady hand and an unblinking eye. I became an absolute fortress on the outside, a respected commander who never flinched when the bullets flew or the bombs dropped. Yet beneath the Kevlar and the metals, the inner child still quietly bled, hiding a profound loneliness that the military hierarchy could never fully cure. The bitter contrast between the immense respect I commanded from hardened combat veterans and the utter disgust I received from my own family created a permanent agonizing dissonance in my soul. I was a hero to strangers, but a complete failure to the people whose blood ran through my veins. It was a burden I carried in absolute silence, but I wore my uniform like a suit of armor, letting the discipline and the structure of the Corps hold my fractured pieces together when the nights grew too quiet and the memories grew too loud. 3. In the blistering, suffocating heat of combat, amidst the absolute chaos of incoming enemy fire and deafening explosions, I finally found exactly what my parents had never given me: absolute unconditional loyalty. We bled into the exact same dirt, sharing our water, our fears, and our lives. In the filthy, blood-stained trenches, no one cared about the size of your bank account or the pedigree of your last name. Our survival meant everything, and the only currency that mattered was trust. When the firefights erupted, the Marines to my left and right did not hesitate to put their bodies between me and flying shrapnel. They did not judge my quiet nature. They relied on my tactical precision to get them home alive. We formed a bond forged in extreme trauma, a brotherhood that ran infinitely deeper than any genetic bloodline. I realized with absolute clarity that this was the family I had always desperately wanted. They did not demand perfection or aristocratic grace. They only demanded that I fight as hard for them as they fought for me. It was in the unforgiving deserts of a war zone that I finally felt entirely accepted, completely shedding the lingering shame of my childhood. It was during one of those brutal deployments that I met Old Mac, a fierce, grizzled veteran who fundamentally changed my understanding of leadership. He was a sergeant who had lost his leg diving onto an improvised explosive device to shield his young squad from the blast, while recovering in the military hospital despite his agonizing physical trauma. His only concern was the mental well-being of the men he had saved. He became my mentor, my compass, and my surrogate father figure. M taught me that true enduring strength is not about crushing people to assert dominance like my brother Daniel did. It is about willingly absorbing the pain so that the broken ones around you can stand back up. His quiet wisdom and unyielding resilience became the anchor for my own sanity. When the nightmares of combat threatened to pull me under, Mac was the one who talked me down, understanding the specific darkness that only soldiers know. He gave me the parental guidance and unconditional support that my father and mother had actively withheld, proving that family is defined by sacrifice, not by a shared last name on a birth certificate. Returning stateside after my final tour, the bitter, sickening reality of how civilian society treats its veterans hit me harder than any enemy ambush. I walked the clean paved streets of the city and saw men I had fought alongside men who had sacrificed their minds and bodies for this country ending up homeless and discarded. The elite class people, exactly like my parents and my brother, stepped over these broken heroes on the sidewalks in utter disgust, treating them like literal trash, cluttering their pristine view. I watched wealthy businessmen in tailored suits recoil from amputees begging for change, entirely blind to the fact that their luxurious freedom was paid for by the blood of the very men they were ignoring. The boiling anger that had simmered inside me since childhood suddenly found a new righteous target. I could not save my own family from their toxic vanity, but I absolutely refused to let my brothers in arms be thrown away by a society that did not understand their sacrifice. That sickening injustice fueled a new burning mission within me, giving my post-military life a desperate and essential purpose. I knew I had to act, utilizing every resource I had left to protect the only family that had ever truly mattered to me. Exactly 2 years ago, I made a decision that severed my final ties to a normal life. I marched into the bank, cashed out my entire life savings, my accumulated combat pay, and my military pension. I took every single cent I owned and bought a rusted, sprawling, abandoned farm on the outskirts of town. Working side by side with Old Mac, I used my own blistered hands to rebuild the collapsed cabins, repair the plumbing, and clear the overgrown fields. We transformed that forgotten plot of dirt into a dedicated sanctuary for veterans battling severe PTSD, homelessness, and addiction. I named it Camp Freedom. It was not a luxury resort. The roofs leaked and the heaters rattled, but it was a fortress of absolute safety. I gave these discarded soldiers a place to sleep, a place to heal, and a purpose to wake up to. As I watched Old Mac hoist the American flag up the newly painted pole, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I had finally built the secure, loving home I never had, entirely safe and completely isolated from the toxic, destructive reach of the Reed bloodline. Just 3 weeks ago, we were finally finding a fragile but beautiful rhythm at Camp Freedom. The veterans were attending group therapy, the vegetable gardens were thriving, and for the first time in years, the night air was not pierced by the sound of someone screaming from a night terror. We were healing. But then the certified letter arrived in the mail, shattering our hard-earned peace. I opened the thick envelope in my small office, my stomach dropping as I read the cold, unforgiving corporate language printed on the heavy cardstock. The bank had quietly sold our remaining property debt. A private shell company had bought it aggressively, a predatory short-term repair loan with a brutal balloon payment clause. They immediately accelerated the deadline, demanding a sudden $5,000 lump sum to clear the title, an amount we could never afford on our meager veteran donations. I sat at my desk, staring at the numbers, feeling the exact same icy terror I used to feel during an ambush. The floor was dropping out from under me. Our sanctuary, the only safe place these men had left in the world, was suddenly on the brink of total collapse. And I had absolutely no idea who was pulling the strings. I knew corporate buyouts were ruthless, but the speed and ferocity of this takeover felt deeply personal, like a targeted missile strike aimed directly at our foundation, desperate to find a loophole. I spent the next 48 hours buried under a mountain of legal paperwork. I dug frantically into the corporate registry, tracing the shell company through a labyrinth of LLCs and holding groups, trying to find the faceless billionaire who was destroying my home. Finally, deep in the state tax records buried under 3 layers of corporate shielding, designed to hide the true owner, I found the parent company. My finger stopped dead on the CEO's signature at the bottom of the deed transfer. The ink was fresh, the handwriting unmistakable, the arrogant, oversized capital D that I had seen scrolled on 1,000 childhood birthday cards that were never meant for me. Daniel Reed. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. My brother did not need this cheap rural land. He owned luxury high-rises and premium fitness centers across the state. This was not a business acquisition. It was an assassination. He had spent what amounted to pocket change for him to buy my debt specifically to crush my sanctuary out of pure unadulterated spite. He could not stand the fact that I had built a life without his permission, a life where I did not bow to the Reed family fortune. He wanted to watch me fail to prove that my military service and my veterans were worthless compared to his capitalistic power. The sheer calculating malice of his actions made my blood run ice cold. He was intentionally turning my brothers in arms out onto the streets just to win a petty family feud. It was the ultimate betrayal, proving that the cruelty of my childhood was not just a phase. It was his permanent defining character. Yesterday morning, the final blow landed. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the dirt driveway of the camp, its lights flashing in the gray dawn. The deputy walked up and wordlessly zip-tied a bright red, legally binding eviction notice onto our iron front gate. The deadline was printed in bold, undeniable black ink. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., the property would be seized, and the bulldozers would arrive to demolish the cabins. The devastating effect on the veterans was immediate and catastrophic. Men who had survived explosive blasts in Fallujah began packing their meager belongings with trembling hands, their eyes hollow with the returning trauma of displacement. I walked the grounds, trying to project absolute calm until I found old Mac. He was sitting in his wheelchair alone by the flagpole far away from the others. The strongest, most resilient man I had ever known was clutching a faded, crinkled photograph of his fallen squad to his chest, sobbing uncontrollably like a lost, terrified child. The sight of a decorated war hero completely broken by a corrupt billionaire's greed shattered my emotional restraint. The disciplined, stoic Marine captain vanished, replaced by a burning primal rage. I realized that passive resistance was no longer an option. I could not let these men be discarded like trash for a second time in their lives. Seeing a grown warrior break down entirely destroyed the calm I had spent years building in the military. I marched over to the front gate and ripped the bright red eviction notice off the iron bars, gripping the paper so tightly that my knuckles turned bone white. I did not bother changing out of my mud-stained work clothes. I hopped into the cab of my rusted, failing Ford truck, the engine roaring in protest as I slammed the transmission into gear. I knew exactly where my brother was. Today was my parents' massive, highly publicized 40th anniversary party at the family estate. The entire local elite, the politicians and the billionaires would be there, sipping champagne on the manicured lawns. I slammed my heavy combat boot down on the gas pedal, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as I sped away from the camp. My heart hammered against my ribs, driven by a furious, desperate adrenaline. I was driving straight back into the toxic, abusive world I had sacrificed everything to escape. I was driving straight into the lion's den, fully prepared to do whatever it took, no matter how humiliating, to get the $5,000 needed to halt the eviction. I was no longer a daughter returning home. I was a commander, launching a desperate one-woman rescue mission into hostile territory. The massive wrought-iron gates of the Reed estate were wide open to welcome the city's aristocracy. My beat-up, rusted Ford truck screeched up the long, winding paved driveway, the squealing, failing brakes entirely shattering, the elegant, soft jazz music floating through the air. I parked aggressively, right next to a line of imported Italian sports cars and a towering crystal fountain that sparkled in the afternoon sun. I killed the sputtering engine and stepped out into the pristine environment. Wearing my heavily mud-stained Carhartt jacket, faded denim, and battered combat boots. The contrast was intentionally jarring. The massive lawn was filled with elite guests in tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. As I walked toward the center of the party, the crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Their faces, usually frozen in polite high society smiles, twisted in utter unrestrained disgust as my dirty boots tracked soil onto the flawless stone pathways. I could hear their harsh, judgmental whispers rippling through the crowd, staring at me as if a rabid animal had just wandered into their exclusive sanctuary. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, completely ignoring their revulsion. My military training allowed me to tune out the noise of the crowd, focusing entirely on my primary objective, finding my brother and securing the cash to save old Mac. Every step I took was a violation of their perfect curated world, but I did not care about their delicate sensibilities. I only cared about the eviction notice burning a hole in my pocket. Before I could even reach my brother, my father spotted me. He abruptly abandoned a circle of wealthy politicians, his face turning a furious, embarrassed shade of crimson. He marched up to me, aggressively blocking my path, his eyes blazing with the same absolute contempt he had shown me since childhood. He did not ask how I was. He did not care that I looked exhausted and desperate. He leaned in his voice, a low hiss designed to avoid a public scene, but sharp enough that every word felt like a poison needle sliding into my ribs. "Are you here to smear my name on this day, Sarah?" Before I could respond, my mother stepped forward, her expensive diamond jewelry sparkling aggressively in the sunlight. She did not bother lowering her voice. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her tone shrieking, with an unhinged, deeply ingrained venom that cut clearly through the sudden silence of the surrounding crowd. "Go back to that garbage dump with your crippled soldiers." She spat, her face contorted with rage. Hearing my own mother publicly degrade the bravest men I had ever known was a sickening blow. They were more offended by the dirt on my jacket than they were by the fact that their own daughter was standing in front of them, begging for her life's work. It was the ultimate confirmation that the Reed family crest was built entirely on vanity, and that I was nothing more than a shameful secret they wanted permanently buried. I swallowed my burning pride, biting my tongue so hard I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I completely ignored my parents' venomous insults, sidestepping them to walk straight up to my brother. He was standing by the outdoor bar, his massive muscular frame casually leaning against the marble counter, his arms crossed over his tailored suit with a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He knew exactly why I was here. I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away every ounce of my Marine Corps ego, and laid myself completely bare before my abuser. "Daniel, write the $5,000 check to clear the loan. I'll pay you back with interest. Just stop the auction, please," I said, my voice tight, with a desperation I had sworn never to show him again. Next to him, my sister-in-law, Patricia, dramatically whipped out a silk handkerchief and covered her nose, rolling her eyes for the benefit of the watching guests. "Oh my God, kick her out. Her stench is making me nauseous." She sneered loudly, her weaponized disgust designed to humiliate me further. The crowd murmured in agreement, fully supporting her cruelty. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on my brother, waiting for his judgment, willing to endure whatever psychological torture he demanded, if it meant old Mac would not sleep on the street tomorrow. In that moment, I was not a captain. I was a hostage entirely at the mercy of a man who thrived on my suffering. My brother threw his head back and laughed, a booming theatrical laugh designed to draw the attention of every single guest at the party. He slowly reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a heavy leather checkbook, and scrolled his signature with a gold pen. He tore the check for $5,000 free, and with deliberate disrespect, threw it directly onto the dirt and grass at my feet. "You want $5,000 to save that garbage dump full of your crippled soldiers?" He sneered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "Step in here and last 3 minutes in the ring with me. If you drop tomorrow morning, I'll drive the bulldozer myself and flatten that camp." The crowd gasped, but quickly shifted into excited, bloodthirsty whispers. My dad, instead of stopping the madness, raised his expensive crystal wine glass to the crowd in enthusiastic agreement. "Teach her a lesson. Let her wake up from her delusion." He cheered, fully endorsing the public beating of his own daughter. I looked down at the small piece of paper resting in the dirt. I thought of old Max's tears, the flag snapping in the wind, and the men who relied on me. I did not argue. I did not scream. I quietly nodded, accepting the brutal terms of this blood contract. I was willing to sacrifice my body to buy their freedom, stepping willingly into the arena to face a man who outweighed me by a 100-pound. If you have ever had to swallow your pride and endure brutal humiliation just to protect the innocent people you love, Please take a moment to like this video. Tell me in the comments down below. How did you survive when your own flesh and blood turned against you? The wealthy elite guests eagerly formed a wide, bloodthirsty circle on the manicured lawn, holding their champagne flutes tight as if they were watching a gladiator match in ancient Rome. My parents took prime VIP seats on the patio, swirling their drinks in excited anticipation of my impending physical punishment. I stood in the center of the grass, the weight of their collective hatred pressing down on me. I slowly, clumsily bent down and began to undo the thick, muddy laces of my heavy combat boots. I slid them off, tossing them aside. My bare feet stepped onto the imported soft grass, and the bitter visual contrast was stark. My skin was heavily calloused, rough, and completely covered in jagged burn marks, and old bullet-gray scars from years of grueling combat deployments. I deliberately hunched my shoulders forward, allowing my spine to curve perfectly, feigning the exhausted, terrified posture of a helpless victim. My brother stepped into the ring, taking off his expensive suit jacket. He cracked his knuckles loudly, his massive 6'3" frame towering over me. He looked at my bowed head, fully believing he was about to get 180 seconds to torture a pathetic lamb. I looked up straight into his eyes, dropping the facade for just a fraction of a second, and my lips curled slightly. "Are you sure? You can last 3 minutes." The quiet, chilling confidence in my voice barely registered in his arrogant mind, completely drowned out by the cheering of the sycophants surrounding us, eager for blood. Richard, the family butler, stepped hesitantly into the center of the circle. His hands were visibly trembling as he looked between my brother's massive muscular physique and my seemingly fragile, dirt-covered frame. With a voice that cracked with nervous reluctance, he shouted to begin the match. Instantly, the illusion of a fair fight evaporated. My brother roared like a wild animal and lunged forward with terrifying practiced MMA speed. He was blinded by his own towering arrogance, fully expecting zero resistance from a woman he considered nothing more than a pathetic, broken runaway. He did not bother to throw a probing jab or test my distance. He went straight for the kill. Shifting his massive weight, he threw a devastating sky-hattering, overhand right punch aimed directly at the center of my face. He fully intended to end this joke of a match in the first 3 seconds, wanting a quick, brutal knockout to satisfy his audience and cement his absolute dominance. The snort's sheer kinetic energy behind his fist was enough to shatter a normal person's jaw into a dozen pieces. The crowd collectively held their breath, waiting for the sickening sound of my collapse, eager to see the rebellious daughter finally put down like a rabid dog on the family lawn. Time seemed to dilate, slowing down to a crawl as his fist closed the distance, his eyes wide with a sadistic, unhinged joy that he was finally legally allowed to destroy me. I did not dodge, I did not flinch, step back, or raise my hands in a frantic panic. By violently forcing my own posture against every natural human instinct, I rapidly tucked my chin to my chest and angled my head downward. And I actively chose to take the massive, heavyweight blow directly on the hardest, thickest part of my skull, the crown of my forehead. A sickening, bone-jarring crack echoed sharply through the quiet yard, loud enough to make several guests gasp in horror. My brother stumbled backward with a sharp hiss of pain, clutching his bruised knuckles. A flash of blinding white light exploded behind my retinas, and warm metallic blood instantly filled my mouth as my lips split against my teeth. The sheer concussive force rattled my brain, but the blinding pain did not break me. It did exactly what I needed it to do. It successfully flipped my military killer switch. The exhausted, begging, victimized sister vanished entirely into the ether. My nervous system locked on to the target. The adrenaline of the battlefield flooded my veins, replacing my fear with absolute terrifying clarity. I was no longer of a civilian asking for a loan. I was a highly trained Marine close quarters combat specialist, and I was now an active weapon. The pain was an old friend, a familiar metric that told me I was still breathing, still fighting, and that the man standing across from me had just made a fatal miscalculation. Furious and deeply confused that I was still standing, my brother's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. He rapidly regained his balance, and abandoning any pretense of restraint, launched a ruthless high-arc MMA roundhouse kick, aimed straight at my temple. It was a kill shot designed to separate me from my consciousness. But this time, I moved. Instead of retreating, I stepped aggressively directly into the arc of the kick, before his leg could reach its full devastating velocity. By closing the distance instantly, I completely killed the momentum of the strike. The impact was nothing more than a dull thud against my ribs. Using his own massive unbalanced weight against him, I shoved both of my hands hard into the center of his chest. The sudden redirection of force sent him tumbling backward, his arms flailing wildly as he crashed unceremoniously onto the grass in front of the entirely horrified crowd. The smug smiles on my parents' faces instantly melted into shock. I stood tall, slowly wiped the thick streak of blood from my split lip with the back of my hand, lowered my center of gravity, and dropped into a lethal, perfectly balanced infantry combat stance. The real fight had just begun. My hands were loose. My eyes were dead and focused, and the chilling aura of a professional killer radiated from my bruised frame, completely shattering my brother's illusion of invincibility. Beather, my brother, let out a guttural, furious roar, completely abandoning his disciplined striking game. Humiliated that a single punch had not ended the fight, he resorted to his heavyweight MMA wrestling, charging forward like a maddened bull to lock me down and crush me beneath his sheer mass. As his massive muscular arms reached out to grapple my waist, I did not resist his forward momentum. Instead, I shifted my weight exactly 1 inch to the side, dropping my hips with practiced military precision. He hit nothing but empty air. In that split second of his overextension, I grabbed the thick collar of his tailored dress shirt. Using his own tremendous kinetic energy as a lethal lever, I pivoted sharply on my calloused heel and threw him over my hip. The resulting slam was catastrophic. His face and chest crashed violently into the manicured grass, the impact shaking the ground. A nearby waiter collided with him, sending trays of expensive crystal champagne flutes shattering violently across the lawn. The sparkling alcohol splashed everywhere, completely soaking the designer evening gowns of the horrified shrieking guests who scrambled backward in sheer terror. I did not celebrate. I did not boast. I simply stood over his prone, gasping body, my breathing slow and entirely controlled. I looked down at him with eyes as cold as a winter grave, and my voice froze the humid night air. 2 minutes and 15 seconds left. The sheer shock on my father's face was palpable. The golden boy he had groomed to be an invincible predator was currently eating dirt at the feet of the daughter he had thrown away. My brother spat out a mouthful of mud and grass, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning panic. He was realizing that the rules of the octagon with its referees and padded mats did not apply here. He was fighting a woman who had survived ambushes in the mountains of Kandahar. My brother scrambled up from the ruined grass like a cornered, desperate animal. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and spilled champagne, and his massive chest heaved with exertion and pure, unadulterated humiliation. He realized that fighting me at a distance was suicide, so he rushed in, forcing a frantic, chaotic clinch. In the desperate tangle of limbs, he abandoned any pretense of sportsmanship and drove a cowardly, brutal knee strike right up into my exposed left side. The impact was devastating. A sickening, bone-snapping crack echoed sharply over the lawn, loud enough to cut through the heavy silence. My lower ribs splintered instantly, sending a wave of blinding white-hot agony tearing through my chest and severely bruising the intercostal muscles. From the sidelines, my sister-in-law, Patricia, let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute delight, thrilled to see me injured. To my absolute disgust, my own father actually clapped his hands in enthusiastic applause, openly cheering for my physical destruction. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my pain. On the battlefield, pain is just a tactical catalyst. It is raw data telling you that you are still alive. I violently refused to give them the satisfaction of a wheeze or a scream. I bit down on my lips so hard it bled again, absorbing the agonizing fire in my torso and channeling it directly into my fists. I could feel the jagged edge of my broken bone shifting with every breath, an agonizing reminder of everything my bloodline had ever done to me. But instead of folding in half like the fragile victim they expected, I straightened my spine. My gaze sharpened into a lethal, unblinking stare that made his smug grin falter and die. The predator had just become the prey. Ignoring the searing fire tearing through my fractured rib cage with every ragged inhalation, I executed a lethal counterstrike, trained into my muscle memory 1,000 times. Before he could pull his knee back to strike again, I plunged my stiffened spear-like fingers straight into the soft, vulnerable hollow of his throat. He gagged violently, his eyes bulging in sudden terror as his airway was instantly compromised, his vice-like grip on my arms immediately loosening as panic set in. I did not give him a fraction of a second to recover. I grabbed a fistful of his slick, sweat-drenched hair, yanked his heavy head violently backward to expose his jawline, and delivered a devastating, bone-jarring military crossface strike directly to the side of his chin. The sheer concentrated force of my forearm, slamming into his jaw, completely short-circuited his equilibrium. His balance shattered entirely as his brain rattled inside his skull. Without missing a beat, I swept his lead leg, slamming his massive, heavyweight frame to the dirt for the second time. The fight visibly left his eyes replaced by the primal, desperate confusion of a bully who had finally met a monster he could not intimidate. Neil, the pristine lawn, once the symbol of my family's untouchable aristocracy, was now a designated combat zone, stained with mud, blood, and spilled alcohol. My brother lay flat on his back, gasping for air, staring up at the night sky in a state of absolute shock. His millions of dollars in the bank, his luxury sports cars, and his parents' adoration could do absolutely nothing to protect him from the harsh, undeniable reality of physical domination. Moving with terrifying, lethal military precision, I did not let him recover. I immediately dropped my weight and slid into a full, inescapable mount directly on his massive chest, pinning his arms beneath my knees. The surrounding crowd was dead, suffocatingly silent. Not a single person, not even my father, dared to intervene or speak. I did not throw flashy gym punches for the audience. I sought the fastest, most effective submission to neutralize the target. I slipped my bloodied hands past his desperate defense and applied a brutal, bare-handed Ezekiel choke. I locked my forearms together, driving the point of my chin directly into his eye socket for leverage, and crushed my wrists against his carotid artery, instantly cutting off the blood flow to his brain. He panicked, his massive hands scratching wildly at my forearms, his fingernails gouging deep, bloody lines into my skin. But I did not flinch. I just continued to breathe steadily, staring directly down into his bulging, terrified eyes. 10, 9, 8, I whispered coldly, audibly, counting down his demise so only he could hear it. His violent struggles grew weaker by the second. His face turned a deep, bruised purple, and his eyes slowly began to roll completely back into his head. The mighty undefeated MMA champion, the arrogant golden boy of the Reed family, raised his trembling hand and weakly tapped out on my shoulder, in absolute undeniable disgrace. The tapping was the sweetest sound I had heard in 20 years. I held the choke for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, just long enough to make him truly understand that his life was entirely in my hands, and that I was sparing him out of pity, not love. I instantly released the chokehold, uncoiling from his chest and standing up in one fluid, defensive motion. My brother rolled onto his side, gagging, sputtering, and coughing violently into the torn, muddy grass. His massive ego was utterly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. As he greedily gasped for oxygen, crying tears of physical panic, he finally realized a devastating truth. His shiny, heavily marketed gym martial arts were a complete laughable joke compared to the merciless life or death reality of survival combat. He did not dare look up at me. The man who had spent his entire life terrorizing me, the man who had confidently promised to destroy me in 3 minutes, was now curled in the fetal position, whimpering in front of the very high society peers he so desperately wanted to impress. The absolute humiliation of publicly tapping out to his estranged, mud-covered sister stripped away every ounce of his manufactured alpha male bravado. I looked down at his trembling, pathetic form, feeling no joy, no triumph, and no vindication. The realization that I had spent years fearing a man so fundamentally weak felt almost absurd. I did not offer him a hand up. I did not offer a word of comfort. I simply stepped back, leaving him to wallow in the ruins of his own shattered pride, knowing he would never ever dare to look down on me again. The soft jazz music that had been playing from the hidden garden speakers was completely dead, likely unplugged by a panicked caterer. The night air hung suffocatingly thick heavy with the metallic scent of blood and spilled champagne. The massive crowd of politicians, socialites, and billionaires was frozen in a state of absolute traumatized horror, entirely unable to comprehend the sheer unadulterated violence they had just enthusiastically begged for minutes prior. My dad and mom stood paralyzed by their velvet VIP chairs, their expensive crystal wine glasses trembling in their manicured hands. They stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, looking at me not as a daughter who had just defended her own life, but as a terrifying, unpredictable demon that had invaded their pristine sanctuary. They did not dare take a single step toward me. The woman standing before them, bleeding but unbowed, was a complete stranger to them. Their wealth, their social standing, and their aristocratic titles were entirely useless against the raw, unfiltered reality of a soldier's discipline. There would be no family reconciliation, no tearful apologies, and no returning to the fold. The terrified silence of the elite crowd was the loudest answer I could have ever received. I was an outcast by their high society standards, but a true survivor by my own. Richard, the aging family butler, was the only person brave enough to break the suffocating silence. He approached me slowly, his polished black shoes crunching softly against the ruined grass. His hands were trembling so violently that he could barely maintain his grip as he reached down and picked up the crumpled, slightly mud-stained $5,000 check from the ground. He held it out to me, his eyes cast downward in a mixture of fear and profound, unspoken respect. He had worked for this family for decades. He knew exactly how much abuse I had suffered, and he had just watched me conquer my lifelong tormentor. I snatched the check from his trembling fingers without saying a single word. The small piece of paper felt incredibly heavy, carrying the weight of my dignity, my cracked rib, and the salvation of Camp Freedom. I carefully folded the check and slid it into the breast pocket of my dirt-stained Carhartt jacket, pressing it securely against my aching chest. The financial ransom had been paid in full, extracted not through begging or submission, but through absolute undeniable force. The transaction was entirely complete. I did not owe Arthur Llewellyn or Daniel Reed anything ever again. The check in my pocket was not just a loan. It was my permanent, irrevocable ticket out of their toxic, manipulative orbit, ignoring the searing pain shooting through my broken rib. I slowly bent down and laced up my battered heavy combat boots, pulling the strings tight with practiced deliberate movements. Once secured, I stood at full attention, my spine straight and my shoulders squared. I swept a cold, utterly disgusted glare across the entire silent patio. I looked at my gasping, humiliated brother, still clutching his throat on the grass. I looked at my sister-in-law, who was cowering fearfully behind a chair, and finally I locked eyes with my parents, letting them see the absolute chilling void where my desperate need for their love used to reside. I did not offer a parting speech. I did not shed a single tear, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Without uttering a single word, I turned my back on my bloodline forever and walked away. The crowd parted silently, shrinking back in fear as I strode through their ranks. The heavy iron gates of the estate closed behind me, with a resounding metallic clang, a physical manifestation of the boundary I had just permanently erected. I was leaving the Reed family fortune behind. But for the first time in my 36 years of existence, I was walking away completely whole. Inside the rusted familiar cabin of my Ford truck, the explosive combat adrenaline finally began to fade, replaced by a crashing wave of sheer physical exhaustion. Every time the heavy tires hit a pothole on the dark winding highway, my cracked ribs screamed in blinding white-hot agony, sending sharp, involuntary gasps tearing through my bruised chest. My knuckles were bruised and swollen, and the split on my lower lip continued to slowly drip warm blood onto my dirty collar. But my right fist was tightly, stubbornly closed around that folded check in my pocket, holding on to it like a lifeline. The physical agony radiating through my torso was an incredibly cheap, gladly paid price for our absolute freedom. I rolled down the window, letting the freezing, biting night air rush into the cabin, actively washing away the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and spilled champagne that clung to my skin. For the first time in my life, the road ahead did not feel like an escape route. It felt like a purposeful march toward a genuine future. The silence in the truck was no longer lonely. It was profoundly peaceful. I was driving away from a mansion filled with strangers and heading toward a dilapidated farm filled with my true family. The pain in my chest was a badge of honor, a price I would willingly pay 1,000 times over to protect the people who actually mattered. Dawn was just beginning to break over the rugged horizon in bruised streaks of gold and deep purple. As I finally pulled up to the rusted iron gates of Camp Freedom, the terrifying threat of the heavy machinery was gone. The bulldozer was nowhere in sight. The morning mist hung low over the quiet, peaceful cabins, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the pine trees in the early wind, sitting exactly where I had left him yesterday, wrapped in a thick wool blanket by the entrance, was old Mac. His wheelchair was parked facing the road, keeping a desperate, sleepless vigil throughout the freezing night. His weathered, deeply lined face looked pale, and his eyes were red-swollen and hollowed out from crying all night in absolute crushing despair, fully believing that our sanctuary was doomed. He looked up at the sound of my squealing brakes, his body tensing in anticipation of the sheriff returning to forcefully evict us. I killed the engine and sat in the cab for a long moment, taking a deep, ragged breath to compose myself, hiding the grimace of pain that threatened to cross my face. I wiped the dried blood from my chin with the back of my sleeve, pulled my heavy Carhartt jacket tight to conceal the unnatural bulge of my fractured rib, and opened the squeaking truck door. The smell of wet earth and pine needles instantly grounded me, welcoming me back to the only patch of dirt on earth where I truly belonged. He saw me step out of the truck, moving with a stiff, heavy limp, my face battered, bruised, and smeared with dry dirt and blood. His eyes widened in shock, but the terror in his expression instantly melted into a radiant, tearful smile of pure, unadulterated relief, just seeing that I had returned alive. He did not ask where I had been. He did not demand explanations about the bruises forming on my jaw, or the awkward way I held my left arm tightly against my side. He simply reached out his callous, scarred hands toward me. I walked over, forcing myself to stand perfectly upright, and placed the folded $5,000 check gently into his weathered palms. I did not tell him about the nightmare I had just survived at the estate. I did not mention the cruel laughter of my parents, or the sickening crack of bone when my brother needed my rib. They did not deserve to occupy a single second of our victory. "We're safe, Mac," I whispered softly, my voice raspy and exhausted. "The camp belongs to us. No one is ever taking it away." The old warrior looked down at the check, the ink blurring as fresh, silent tears of overwhelming gratitude spilled over his cheeks. He did not need the gory details to understand the massive sacrifice I had just made. He reached up, gripping my shoulder with a fierce, trembling strength. In his tear-filled eyes, I saw the unconditional love, respect, and pride that my biological father had violently withheld my entire life. Still holding my injured side to brace against the throbbing ache, I stepped back and looked up at the tall white flagpole in the center of the camp. The weathered, slightly frayed American flag was snapping fiercely in the cold morning wind, illuminated brilliantly by the rising sun. Staring up at those stars and stripes, a profound, unshakable realization washed over me. I did not just beat my brother in a physical fight tonight. I had permanently, irrevocably defeated the toxic psychological hold of my past. I had fought a brutal, bloody war on a manicured aristocratic lawn entirely alone, and I had successfully protected my real family. The Reed bloodline, with all its billions of dollars, its sprawling estates, and its bottomless cruelty, had ultimately lost to the sheer, unbreakable willpower of a discarded soldier. I took a deep, steady breath of the crisp morning air, feeling the agonizing pinch in my fractured rib, and smiled for the first time in weeks. The trauma of my childhood was finally laid to rest in the dirt of that estate. The scars on my feet, The fracture in my chest and the bruises on my face were not marks of victimhood. They were the hard-earned medals of my ultimate liberation. Behind me, I could hear the first cabin doors creaking open as the other veterans shuffled out into the morning light. One by one, they saw the flag, saw Max's tears of relief, and understood without a single word being spoken that their home had been saved. A few of them saluted the flag. A few of them saluted me. I did not need a Reed family crest above my fireplace. I did not need a mansion or a trust fund or a single cent of inherited wealth. I had something my brother with all his millions could never buy. I had people who would bleed for me because I had bled for them first. I turned back to Mac, who was already rolling his wheelchair toward the Masal to start the morning coffee. I limped slowly after him, bathed in the golden light of the self-made sunrise, stepping confidently into a future where I was entirely unapologetically free. Sometimes the family we build from shared scars is infinitely stronger than the one we were born into. If you agree, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would love for you to share your own story in the comments about how you walked away from toxicity and found your true peace.